The boiling water left her hands before she could think. Fletcher Stone's scream shattered the mountain silence as his skin melted. 4 armed men had broken into the cabin. They expected a frightened girl. They found a warrior with a cast-iron skillet and nothing left to lose. But that battle was just the beginning. Because the real question wasn't whether Abigail Hartwell could survive the mountain. It was whether the mountain could survive her. This is her story. Winter, 1885. Wyoming Territory. The debt wasn't paid in gold, it was paid in flesh. And the mountain man who came to collect. He was the last person anyone expected to show mercy. Because 20 years earlier in the mud of Shiloh, he learned that mercy gets men killed. The wind howled through the Teton Range like the screams of the dead, carrying with it the bitter promise of a harsh season. In a territory where survival was measured in ammunition and firewood, where widows outnumbered wives and graves outnumbered gardens, debts were serious business. A man's word was his currency, and when that currency failed, payment came due in ways that haunted families for generations. But what Elijah Blackwood demanded that night would shock the entire town of Bitter Creek. He didn't want the ranch with its rotting barn and depleted soil. He didn't want the cattle that had long since been sold to cover other debts. He pointed his leather-gloved finger at a girl they called worthless, a girl whose father was ready to throw her away like spoiled meat. And what he really needed her for, nobody could have guessed. Not the townspeople who whispered about her size, not her father who saw her only as a burden, not even Abby herself who believed she was being sold into a fate worse than death. This is the true story of how a forgotten daughter became a warrior, how a man who lost everything in the war found something worth dying for, and how one winter on that mountain they uncovered a conspiracy that would have destroyed every veteran, every widow, every family that bled for this country. But first, they had to survive each other. Her name was Abigail Hartwell, and this is the night she was sold. The Hartwell homestead squatted on the edge of Bitter Creek like a wounded animal waiting to die. The logs, once sturdy and proud when Captain William Hartwell built them with his own hands after the war, now sagged with the weight of neglect and broken promises. Wind whistled through gaps that should have been chinked with fresh mud months ago. The roof leaked in 3 places, and buckets positioned beneath the drips played a hollow percussion every time the snow melted enough to seep through. Inside, the air was thick with the sour stench of cheap whiskey and the acrid smoke of burning pine. Abigail Hartwell sat on a sturdy oak stool near the fire, her large, capable hands working rhythmically to mend a tear in her father's coat. At 22 years old, Abby was a woman of substantial size, heavy as a prize heifer, as the town boys would jeer when she dared walk into town for supplies. She had learned long ago to make herself small in spirit, even if she could never be small in body. Her world was contained within these 4 failing walls and the constant crushing anxiety of her father's debts. She didn't know it yet, but in exactly 6 hours her life would change forever. And the man responsible was riding through a blizzard, at that very moment, his face set like granite, his purpose as cold and certain as the Wyoming winter. Captain William Hartwell paced the floorboards, his boots clicking nervously against the worn wood. He was a thin, wiry man, hollowed out by guilt and whiskey, a ghost wearing the uniform of the living. At 52, he looked 70. The war had aged him, but what came after what he had done after had destroyed him. He wiped sweat from his brow despite the chill that permeated every corner of the room. "He's not coming tonight, Abby," Will muttered more to convince himself than her. "The pass is snowed in. No man would risk his horse for a few $100s in this weather." Abby didn't look up from her mending. Her needle moved with practiced precision, each stitch even and tight. She had learned to sew from her mother, back when there was still hope in this house, back when Ruth Hartwell's laughter could fill a room and make even the hardest winter seem bearable. "Elijah Blackwood would walk through hell for a nickel if it was owed to him, Pa," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have borrowed from a mountain man. You know what they say about him. They say he killed 3 men in Abilene just for looking at his saddle wrong." Will poured another glass of whiskey, his hands trembling. "It was the only way, girl. I needed the money, the seed crops, the drought." "The poker table at the Gilded Lily," Abby corrected softly, still not looking up. The truth hung between them like smoke. They both knew where the money had gone. They both knew this moment had been inevitable. Will Hartwell had been running from his debts for 5 years, ever since Ruth died, ever since the last good thing in his life had slipped away and left him with nothing but memories and mistakes. But what Abby didn't know, what Will couldn't bear to tell her, was that his debt to Blackwood was the least of his problems. The real debt, the one that would damn them both, was owed to a far more dangerous man. A man who wore expensive suits and smiled with teeth that had never known hunger. A man who had bought Will's soul 20 years ago on a battlefield and who was now coming to collect the interest. Will reached for the bottle again, but his hand froze halfway. Not from the cold, not from the whiskey already coursing through his veins, but from memory. He remembered the last time he stood before a debt he couldn't pay. It was 1863, and he was Captain Hartwell of Company K Union Army. He had borrowed money from the sutler to buy extra ammunition for his men, good men who trusted him, who followed him because they believed he would bring them home. The sutler had demanded payment. Will had nothing, so the sutler made a deal. Lead your men through the shortcut, the dangerous pass, and we'll call it even. It's faster. You'll be heroes. It was an ambush. Confederate forces had been waiting. 32 men died in the first volley. 30 men who had wives and children and mothers who would never see them again. Will survived. He always survived. They court-martialed him, but there wasn't enough evidence. Not enough to convict. Just enough to brand him to make sure every man who served after that day knew that Captain William Hartwell was the kind of officer who got his men killed. And now, 20 years later, he was about to make the same mistake, about to sacrifice someone he loved to save himself. "Pa," Abby said, and her voice was different now, tighter. "You said the crops. You said the drought. But Mama died 5 years ago, and you've been borrowing ever since. What is it really about?" Will looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time in months. She was so much like Ruth, the same determined set to her jaw, the same clear, honest eyes that saw through every lie. But where Ruth had been slight and delicate, Abby was solid and strong, built for this harsh land in a way her mother never was. "I'm trying to keep us alive, Abby, that's all, just trying to keep the roof over our heads. By burying us in debt we can't repay." Before Will could answer, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. Not a knock. A command. 3 heavy impacts against the door that made the frame shudder. Thud, thud, thud. The room went silent except for the crackle of the fire and the hammering of 2 terrified hearts. Will froze the glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. Abby felt her own heart begin to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood slowly, instinctively, smoothing her apron over her wide hips, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the shadows of the kitchen corner. But there was no hiding from what was coming. The door creaked open, pushed inward against the wind. A figure filled the frame, blocking out the moonlight and the swirling snow beyond. Elijah Blackwood was a giant of a man standing well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders so broad they seemed to span the width of the doorway. He wore a coat made of bear fur dusted with fresh snow and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that glinted like shards of flint in the firelight. He carried a Winchester rifle loosely in one hand, but the threat wasn't in the weapon. It was in his stillness, in the way he stood there absolutely motionless, letting his presence fill the room like ice water. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut with a heavy boot. The room seemed to shrink around him. "Captain Hartwell," Elijah said. His voice was a deep rumble like rocks grinding together underground. "Mr. Blackwood," Will stammered, putting the table between himself and the intruder. "I was just saying the weather is fierce tonight. Didn't expect anyone could make it through. Can I offer you a drink?" Elijah ignored the offer. He reached into his coat with deliberate slowness and pulled out a small black ledger. He flipped it open with his thumb, the pages crackling in the silence. He flipped it open to a page marked with a torn scrap of fabric. "October 14th, he said, his finger tracing a line he had memorized. $500. Due at first snow." He'd had someone read it to him weeks ago, committed every word to memory. He looked up, his gray eyes fixing on Will with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "It's snowing, Captain." The way he said the rank made it sound like an insult. A reminder that Will Hartwell had once been someone who commanded respect, someone who led men into battle. Now he was just another debtor trying to talk his way out of what he owed. I know," Will pleaded, his hands raised as if in surrender. "But the cattle the market dropped significantly this year. I need more time, just until spring. I swear on my wife's grave I'll have the money by spring." Elijah's expression didn't change. "Your wife is buried in a pauper's field because of you," he said, his voice devoid of pity. "Your word is worth less than the dirt on my boots. I'm here for the collateral." Will's face went pale. The blood drained from his cheeks as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. "The ranch," he croaked. "Take the ranch, Elijah. Please. It's all I have. If you take the deed, we'll starve." "I don't want this shack," Elijah said, looking around the dilapidated room with disdain. "The roof leaks. The soil is dead. The barn is rotting. This place isn't worth $500. "Then what?" Will cried, his voice breaking. "I have nothing else. Nothing." Elijah's eyes moved past Will. They drifted into the shadows of the kitchen, locking onto Abigail. Abby held her breath. She was used to men looking at her with disgust, with amusement, or simply looking right through her as if she didn't exist. But Elijah looked at her with a terrifying intensity that made her skin prickle with fear. He scanned her from her worn boots to her flushed cheeks. He looked at her not as a person, but as an object he was appraising. His gaze lingered on her hands, large and capable, scarred from work and rough from the cold. "Her," Elijah said, pointing a leather-gloved finger directly at Abby. Time seemed to stop. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And in that frozen moment, 3 lives changed forever. Will blinked, confused. "The stove, the girl." Elijah clarified, his voice flat and cold. Abby gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Will looked back and forth between the mountain man and his daughter, and a sick realization began to dawn on his face. "Abby!" Will laughed nervously, the sound brittle and desperate. "Mr. Blackwood, you can't be serious. She's well, look at her. She's heavy. She eats more than she works. She's no prize beauty to be taken as payment. If you want a woman, there are girls at the Gilded Lily who are—" "I didn't ask for a whore." Elijah cut him off, his voice sharpening like a blade. "And I didn't ask for your opinion on her worth." He took a step closer to Will, and despite the fact that Will was armed, despite the fact that he had once led men into battle, he shrank back like a scolded child. "You owe me $500 plus interest," Elijah continued. "The girl goes with me, and the debt is wiped clean. Every penny. You walk away free." Will stared at him, trying to process what was being offered. "You want to marry her?" "I need a cook," Elijah said. "A keeper for my cabin up on the ridge. Someone strong enough to haul wood and not break like a twig in the winter." It wasn't the truth. Or perhaps it was only part of the truth. His face gave nothing away. But in his mind, Elijah was calculating. He needed someone who could read, someone educated enough to decipher the documents he had stolen, someone the town wouldn't immediately miss. And he needed to get her away from Will Hartwell before the captain's other debts came due in blood. "She packs her things," Elijah said. "We leave in 10 minutes. Abby felt the room spin around her. Sold. She was being sold like a head of cattle to a man rumored to be half wolf, half devil, and her father, her own father, was actually considering it. Will looked at the ledger, then at Abby. In his daughter's face he saw his dead wife. He saw the girl he used to toss into the air when she was small enough to lift. He saw 22 years of failed promises and broken dreams. But he also saw his freedom. He saw a winter without threats, without fear of men coming in the night. "Abby," Will said, his voice weak and cracking. "Pack your bag." The single word hung in the air like a death sentence. Abby stared at her father, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Surely he didn't mean it. Surely this was some kind of negotiation tactic, some way to buy more time. "Pa," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't," she cried out louder. "He's a stranger. He'll kill me." "Pa, please!" Will's face twisted, his shame transforming into anger the way it always did when he was confronted with his own cowardice. "He's offering to clear the debt, Abby," he yelled. "Do you have $500 tucked in your apron?" "No." "Then what choice do we have? You're 22 years old and unwed. No man is coming for you. You're eating me out of house and home as it is. Go with him." The betrayal hit her harder than any physical blow could have. This was the man she had nursed through countless hangovers, the man she had cooked for and cleaned for without complaint, the man she had sacrificed her own youth to care for. And now he was discarding her like garbage to save his own skin. But what Abby couldn't see, what the firelight and shadows hid, was the single tear that rolled down Will Hartwell's weathered cheek. She couldn't see the way his hand trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. She couldn't see the war raging inside him, the memory of Ruth's final words echoing in his mind. "Take care of our Abby, Will. Promise me. Whatever happens, you take care of our girl." He had promised. With Ruth's cold hand in his, her breathing shallow and labored, he had sworn on everything he held sacred that he would protect their daughter. And now he was breaking that promise. Again. Just like he had broken every promise that mattered. Elijah stepped forward, his massive frame looming over Abby. He was so large he seemed to eclipse the light from the fire. 10 minutes, girl," he said, his voice low and steady. "Bring warm clothes. You won't find silk up on the mountain." Abby looked into Elijah's eyes, searching desperately for a glimmer of mercy, for some sign that he wasn't the monster the town claimed he was. She found none. She found only a hard, dark resolve that seemed to go down forever, like looking into a well with no bottom. With tears streaming down her round cheeks, she turned and ran to her small room. The floorboards creaked under her weight, each step marking the end of her life as she knew it. Her room was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed and small chest that held all her possessions. She grabbed her worn carpet bag and began throwing things inside with shaking hands. 2 wool dresses, both tight at the seams, patched and repatched over the years. Her mother's Bible, the pages soft and well-worn from Ruth's faithful reading. A hairbrush with half the bristles missing. And finally, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, a small locket containing a faded photograph of her mother. Abby paused, looking at her mother's face. Ruth had been beautiful, delicate, everything Abby was not. Ruth had been the kind of woman men wrote poetry about, the kind of woman who could make even a hardened soldier like Will Hartwell believe in goodness. "I'm sorry, Mama," Abby whispered to the photograph. "I tried to take care of him like you asked. I tried." She snapped the locket shut and tucked it into the bottom of her bag. Then she looked around her room one last time, knowing with absolute certainty that she would never see it again. The quilt her mother had stitched, the shelf that held her few precious books, the window that looked out over the failing ranch, all of it gone, all of it lost. When she emerged from her room, Will was pouring another drink, his back to her. He couldn't look at her, couldn't face what he had done. Abby waited for him to turn around to say something, to show even the smallest shred of remorse. But he just stood there silent, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his shame. "I'm ready," Abby said, her voice hollow. Elijah nodded and opened the door. The wind rushed in sharp and bitter, carrying with it the promise of a long, hard journey. Abby wrapped her shawl tighter around herself and stepped toward the door. Just before she crossed the threshold, she heard her father's voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." It wasn't loud enough for her to hear clearly. Perhaps he didn't want her to hear. Perhaps he was only saying it to convince himself that he still had some shred of decency left. But Abby didn't turn around. She walked out into the snow and the darkness, and she didn't look back. Outside, the cold was brutal, stealing the breath from her lungs. Abby stood by Elijah's massive black stallion, clutching her carpet bag and trying not to think about what lay ahead. The horse was enormous, a Percheron mix built for hauling timber and pulling stumps from frozen ground. It snorted its breath, coming out in great clouds of steam. Elijah mounted the horse with an easy grace that belied his size. He looked down at Abby, waiting. "Give me your hand," he said. Abby hesitated. She looked at the height of the horse, then down at her own body. Shame burned through her, hot and acidic. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm too heavy, Mr. Blackwood. I'll hurt the horse. I can't get up there." Elijah didn't mock her. He didn't laugh or make a crude joke about her size. He simply dismounted his boots, crunching in the snow, and walked around to stand in front of her. "This horse has pulled stumps out of the ground," he said matter-of-factly. "He won't notice you." Before Abby could protest further, Elijah grabbed her by the waist. His grip was iron-hard, his strength undeniable. With a grunt of exertion that was surprisingly brief, he hoisted her up. Abby scrambled, humiliated, hauling her weight onto the saddle horn until she was seated, her legs dangling awkwardly. Elijah swung up behind her, his chest pressing against her back. He smelled of pine resin and tobacco and the metallic tang of the cold. His arms reached around her to hold the reins, forming a cage she couldn't escape. "Hold on," he ordered. He kicked the horse, and they surged forward into the night. The journey up into the mountains was a nightmare of cold and fear. They left the valley floor and began the steep ascent into the jagged peaks of the Teton Range. The wind grew fiercer with every passing mile, whipping snow into their faces until Abby couldn't tell if the moisture on her cheeks was from the storm or from her own tears. She had no choice but to lean back against Elijah for warmth and stability. His arms, reaching around her to hold the reins, formed a barrier against the worst of the wind. But even as her body sought his heat, her mind recoiled from the intimacy of it. For hours they rode in silence. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees, the crunch of the horse's hooves in the snow, and the steady rhythm of Elijah's breathing against her spine. Abby's legs ached from gripping the horse. Her inner thighs chafed raw against the saddle and her own skin. She was cold, tired, and terrified. She kept waiting for him to speak, to tell her what he really wanted. Men didn't take women like her for housekeeping. Not men like Elijah Blackwood. There had to be something else, some darker purpose she couldn't yet see. But Elijah noticed things others might miss. As they climbed higher, he kept checking the back trail, his body tensing at every sound from the trees. This wasn't the behavior of a man simply collecting a debt. This was the behavior of a soldier expecting an ambush. "Why me?" Abby finally asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Elijah didn't answer for a long time. They navigated a narrow switchback, the drop-off on Abby's right plunging into a black abyss that seemed to have no bottom. One wrong step, and they would both tumble into nothingness. "Your father is a fool," Elijah finally said, his voice rumbling against her spine. "I know," Abby replied bitterly. "But he said one thing true." Elijah continued. "You stayed. You took care of a man who didn't deserve it. You didn't run off with the first peddler passing through town, didn't disappear into the night when things got hard. Most people, when life gets difficult, they run. They abandon their responsibilities. But you stayed." "I had nowhere to go," Abby admitted. "Who would take me?" "Loyalty is rare," Elijah muttered almost to himself. "Rarer than gold in these hills." The answer confused Abby. He had bought her for loyalty. It made no sense. But before she could ask more questions, Elijah spoke again, and this time his voice carried a weight that made Abby's breath catch. 20 years ago," he began, "I was 16 years old. My brother Tommy was 14. We enlisted in the Confederate Army Company D, convinced we were fighting for something that mattered. We were boys playing at being men too young to understand what war really meant." Abby listened, afraid to breathe, afraid he would stop talking if she made any sound at all. "We had a supplier, a man named Marcus Caldwell. He was young then, ambitious, working his way up from nothing. He promised us ammunition, a full shipment enough to hold our position against Union forces advancing through Tennessee. We pooled our money, every penny we had, and paid him in advance." The wind howled, but Elijah's voice was steady, controlled, as if he had told this story so many times in his head that the emotion had been worn away like stone under water. "The shipment never came. The Union attacked. We held our position for 20 minutes before we ran out of bullets. After that it was bayonets and fists and prayers that went unanswered." He paused, and Abby felt his body tense behind her. 32 men died on that hill. Tommy was one of them. My little brother, 14 years old, died with bayonet wounds in his gut because Marcus Caldwell sold our ammunition to the Union Army for a higher price. Abby's heart clenched. She understood now. This wasn't just about debt. This wasn't about money or property. This was about justice that had been delayed for 2 decades. And now, she asked quietly, is Marcus Caldwell still alive? He's the mayor of Bitter Creek, Elijah said, and there was such cold fury in his voice that Abby shivered. He used the money from his war profiteering to buy land to build businesses to make himself respectable. Everyone thinks he's a pillar of the community, but I know what he is, and one day I'm going to make him pay for every man who died because of his greed. They rode in silence after that, the weight of Elijah's story settling over them like the snow. Abby understood now why he needed her. She could read, could decipher documents that he couldn't. And if Mayor Caldwell was as corrupt as Elijah believed, there would be papers evidence proof of crimes that went far beyond a single betrayal on a battlefield. By the time they reached the plateau where Elijah's cabin stood, Abby was numb from cold and exhaustion. The cabin was not the shack she had expected. It was a sturdy, sprawling structure made of thick logs with a stone chimney that promised a massive fire. A lean-to stable was attached to the side, and through the swirling snow, Abby could see that the entire place had been built with care and skill. Elijah stopped the horse and slid off with practiced ease. He reached up for Abby, and this time she was too exhausted to care about dignity. She practically fell into his arms, and for a split second she was pressed against him, her softness against his hardness. His face was inches from hers, and she saw his eyes, gray and storm-tossed, widen slightly as he held her weight. He set her down abruptly, almost roughly, as if her proximity had unsettled him in some way he didn't want to acknowledge. "Inside," he said gruffly. "Fire's likely dead. Start it up." Abby stumbled toward the door, her legs wobbling like a newborn calf. She pushed inside and was immediately struck by how clean everything was. She had expected the lair of a savage, a place of dirt and disorder. Instead, she found shelves lined with books-cured furs on the walls that spoke of skill and patience, and not a speck of dust anywhere. This was not the home of a mindless brute. This was the home of a man who valued order, who took pride in his surroundings. Abby found the woodpile and knelt before the massive stone hearth. Her fingers fumbled with the flint enkindling, her hands clumsy from the cold. Behind her she could hear Elijah outside tending to the horse, murmuring to the animal in a voice so gentle it made her wonder if she had imagined the cold fury from earlier. As the fire slowly came to life, Abby looked around the room more carefully. Her eyes landed on a heavy wooden table in the center of the space. On it sat a partially disassembled revolver, its pieces laid out with methodical precision, and next to the gun, a map. Curiosity drew her closer. The map wasn't of the entire territory. It was a geological survey of the specific ridge they were on, marked with red ink. Circles and X marks covered the parchment, but what caught her attention was the center where a name had been written and circled 3 times. Caldwell Mining Company. Mayor Marcus Caldwell, the man who owned the bank, the general store, and half the businesses in Bitter Creek, the man who had betrayed Elijah's brother and 31 other soldiers for profit. Why did Elijah have a map of Caldwell's mining interests? What was he planning? The door opened behind her, and Abby jumped back from the table as if it had burned her. Elijah entered carrying saddlebags, snow melting on his shoulders. He kicked the door shut with his boot and looked at her, then at the table. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Curiosity gets people killed up here, Abby," he said softly. The way he said her name without the formality of Miss Hartwell sent a shiver down her spine. It was intimate, possessive, as if by bringing her to this mountain he had claimed the right to use her given name. "I was just looking for matches." She lied badly. Elijah walked over to the table and picked up the disassembled gun. He began putting it back together with quick, efficient movements, each piece clicking into place with the ease of long practice. When the gun was whole again, he holstered it and turned to face her fully. The firelight cast long dancing shadows across his scarred face. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His features were too harsh, his jaw too square, his nose broken and healed crooked. But there was something compelling about him, something that made it hard to look away. "You're here to cook," Elijah said, his voice low and steady. "You're here to clean. And you're here to keep your mouth shut about what you see in this cabin." He walked toward her, and Abby backed up instinctively until she hit the wall. He placed one hand on the rough wood beside her head, trapping her but not touching her. He was so large he seemed to block out the entire room. "And one more thing," he whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly low that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "There are wolves in these woods, two-legged ones. If anyone comes to this door while I'm gone, you don't open it. Not for the sheriff, not for a priest, and especially not for anyone named Caldwell. Do you understand?" Abby nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Say it," Elijah commanded. "I understand," Abby managed to whisper. "Good." He pushed off the wall and walked to the door, grabbing his rifle on the way. "There's salt pork in the pantry. Make a stew. I'm going to check the perimeter." He stepped out into the storm again, leaving Abby trembling against the wall. This wasn't just a debt collection. This wasn't simply a man needing a housekeeper. She had walked into the middle of a war, a conflict that had been brewing for 20 years, and she had no idea which side she was supposed to be on. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking not just from the cold, but from fear and confusion and something else she couldn't quite name. She wasn't the dainty, fragile heroine from the dime novels she used to read by candlelight. She was big, she was slow, and she was scared. But as she stood there pressed against the rough logs of Elijah Blackwood's cabin, a spark of something fierce ignited in her chest. Her father had thrown her away like trash. This mountain man thought he could buy her like property. But she was not cattle. She was not chattel. She walked back to the fireplace and struck the flint hard against the steel. The spark caught the tinder, and a flame roared to life, bright and defiant in the darkness. "I will survive this mountain," Abby said aloud to the empty cabin, "and I will make Elijah Blackwood regret the day he thought he could own me." But even as she spoke the words, somewhere deep inside, in a place she wasn't ready to acknowledge, Abby wondered if perhaps being owned by Elijah Blackwood might be the first time in her life that anyone had thought she was worth claiming. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. And on the wind, if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of horses in the distance. 4 riders moving through the blizzard with purpose, following tracks that were rapidly being covered by snow. Fletcher Stone and his men were coming, and they had explicit orders from Mayor Caldwell. Bring back the girl, burn the cabin, and make sure Elijah Blackwood never made it down the mountain alive. The war was about to begin, and neither Abby nor Elijah knew just how deep the conspiracy ran or how many lives hung in the balance of what would happen in the days to come. But they would learn. In blood and fire and betrayal, they would learn the true cost of standing against men who believed themselves above justice. And in that learning, they would discover something neither of them expected, that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that nobody else wanted, that loyalty can be found in the most unlikely places, and that love, when it finally comes, doesn't ask for permission or wait for the perfect moment. It simply arrives like a storm on a winter night, fierce and undeniable and impossible to resist. Morning came not with the warmth of sunlight, but with a blinding white glare off the snow that encased the cabin like a tomb. Abby woke with a gasp, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle from her neck to her ankles ached from the brutal ride up the mountain. For a moment, staring at the rough-hewn timber of the ceiling, she forgot where she was. She reached instinctively for the familiar, lumpy mattress of her father's house, but her hand met instead the soft, thick pelt of a buffalo robe. Memory crashed back like a landslide. The debt, the mountain man, the sail. She sat up slowly, the heavy robe falling away to reveal her nightdress. She felt exposed even in the empty room, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the thin fabric. She was used to hiding her body, layering shawls and aprons to mask the curves and rolls that the townspeople found so offensive. Here, there was nowhere to hide. The cabin was silent. No sound of breathing, no creak of floorboards. Elijah was gone. Abby dressed hurriedly, her fingers stiff with cold as she fumbled with the buttons of her wool dress. It was tight across the bust and dug into her waist, a constant pinching reminder of her size, of her failure to be the kind of woman men wanted. She stepped out into the main room, wrapping her arms around herself. The fire had burned down to embers, but the room was still surprisingly warm. The thick log walls held heat well better than her father's drafty house ever had. On the heavy wooden table lay a slab of cured bacon, a sack of flour, and a canister of coffee. Beside them was a note scrawled in charcoal on a scrap of parchment. "Eat. Don't open the door." Abby looked at the food spread before her. Her stomach rumbled a deep hollow sound that seemed to echo in the empty cabin. But shame tightened her throat, made it hard to breathe. For years her father had watched her eat with a sneer, counting every biscuit, making comments about how no husband would want a wife who cost so much to feed. She had learned to eat in secret, scavenging scraps when no one was looking, which only made the weight stay and the shame grow deeper. But she was hungry. Desperately, achingly hungry in a way that went beyond the missed meals of yesterday. It was as if her body, freed from the constant judgment of her father's house, was finally allowing itself to feel the deprivation it had endured for years. She didn't know it yet, but in exactly 6 hours, everything she thought she understood about Elijah Blackwood would be turned upside down. The man she believed had bought her for servitude was about to reveal a truth that would make her question every assumption she had ever made about power, about worth, about what it meant to be valuable. Abby set to work, not for herself, but because she feared what Elijah would do if she disobeyed. She knew how to work a kitchen. It was the one place she felt competent, the one skill nobody could mock or take away. Her large, capable hands that could knead tough dough into silk, went to work with practiced efficiency. She sliced the bacon thick, and the smell of rendering fat filled the cabin with a savory, heavy scent that made her mouth water. She made biscuits, mixing the flour and lard with a rhythm that soothed her jangled nerves. The physical work was comforting, familiar, a piece of home in this strange and frightening place. She was just pulling the golden brown biscuits from the Dutch oven when the door opened. Elijah walked in, bringing with him a gust of freezing air and the sharp scent of pine. He was carrying 2 skinned rabbits, their red carcasses stark against the snow, clinging to his boots. He tossed them onto the prep table without ceremony and walked to the basin to wash the blood from his hands. He didn't smile, didn't say good morning, didn't acknowledge her presence at all until he had dried his hands and sat down at the table with the weariness of a man who had been awake all night. "Coffee," he grunted. It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered in that same gravelly voice that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his chest. Abby poured him a cup with trembling hands and set a plate of bacon and biscuits in front of him. Then she retreated to the corner of the kitchen, intending to wait until he was finished, as she always did with her father. Elijah took a bite of biscuit. He chewed slowly, his gray eyes fixed on the window, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes. Then he stopped. He looked at the empty space across from him, at the table. He looked at Abby standing by the stove with her hands clasped tight in her apron. "Sit," he commanded. Abby's heart jumped. "I'm not hungry, Mr. Blackwood." The lie was obvious. Her stomach had been growling loud enough for him to hear. "I didn't ask if you were hungry," Elijah said, his voice flat. "I said sit." Abby moved slowly, pulling the heavy chair out. The wood groaned under her weight, and she flinched, waiting for the inevitable insult. "Careful, you'll break the furniture." It never came. Elijah pushed the platter of bacon toward her. "Eat. You're no good to me if you faint from hunger. It's 10 below zero outside. The cold burns calories faster than you can put them in." Abby took a single biscuit, picking at it nervously. The first bite was heaven warm and buttery and perfect, but years of conditioning made her eat slowly, carefully, trying to take up as little space as possible, even in the act of nourishment. Elijah's hand slammed down on the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the small room, and Abby jumped so violently she dropped the biscuit. "Stop acting like a kicked dog." Elijah growled, his voice low and dangerous. He leaned forward, and Abby found herself unable to look away from his face. Up close, she could see the scars that marked him, a thin white line across his left cheekbone, a puckered mark on his jaw that looked like a bullet graze. These were not the marks of a man who had lived an easy life. "I've seen how you look at yourself," he continued, and there was something in his voice now, something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't quite pity either. "You think because you take up space you're taking too much of the world. Your father put that nonsense in your head to keep you small, to keep you serving him without complaint." He leaned closer, and Abby could see the flecks of gold in his steel-gray eyes, could smell the pine and leather, and something else, something distinctly male and not unpleasant. "Up here survival is about mass," Elijah said. "It's about insulation. A waif like the girls in town would freeze to death in a week. You have substance, Abby. Stop apologizing for it." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't. He wasn't looking at her fat as a defect. He was looking at it as utility, as something that had value and purpose. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was a statement of fact delivered with a rough intensity that unsettled her more than mockery ever could. "Now eat the damn bacon," he said, leaning back and taking a sip of coffee. "We have work to do." Abby ate. For the first time in her life, she ate a full meal in front of a man without being mocked, without having to justify every bite, without feeling like she was stealing food that should belong to someone more deserving. The bacon was crispy and salt, the biscuits tender and rich. It settled the shaking in her hands and the hollow ache in her belly. After a long silence, she found the courage to speak. "What work?" Elijah studied her for a moment as if deciding how much to reveal. "You read, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. "I saw the books in your bag." "Yes," Abby confirmed. "Good," Elijah said, standing up. "Because I can't." The admission hung in the air like smoke. The terrifying mountain man, the one who negotiated debts and scared sheriffs, the one who had ridden through a blizzard to collect what was owed, couldn't read. Abby stared at him, trying to reconcile this vulnerability with the hard, dangerous man who had dragged her up a mountain. Elijah walked to a heavy iron chest at the foot of his bed. He unlocked it with a key from his belt and pulled out a stack of papers. They were crinkled and stained with dirt and oil, handled many times but carefully preserved. He dropped them on the table in front of Abby with a heavy thud. "These are land surveys," Elijah said. "Stolen from the Caldwell Mining Company office in Denver 3 weeks ago." Abby's eyes went wide. "You stole from Mayor Caldwell." "Mayor Caldwell is a thief who wears a suit," Elijah spat. "He's been buying up land all along the darker side of the ridge. He tells the ranchers the land is sour, buys it for pennies. Then a month later he finds silver veins. But he's looking for something else now, something bigger." Elijah tapped a specific document with his scarred finger. "I need you to read these. All of them. Find out where he's digging next. Because if he crosses the creek line," he pointed out the window to the frozen stream that marked the edge of the property, "he's coming for this cabin, and I'm going to kill him." Abby looked at the papers, her hands hovering over them, but not quite touching. She realized then that she hadn't been brought here just to cook and clean. She had been brought here because she was the educated daughter of a man who had moved in those circles because Elijah Blackwood was fighting a one-man war against the most powerful man in the territory, and he needed someone who could read the language of his enemy. She was an accomplice now, whether she wanted to be or not. "And if I find out?" Abby asked, her voice steadying despite her fear. "What then?" Elijah looked at her, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened just a fraction. It was like watching ice begin to thaw, just the barest hint of something warmer beneath. "Then we set a trap," he said. "You help me save this mountain abbey, and I swear to you, you'll never have to bow your head to a man like your father again." It was a seduction, but not of the body. It was a seduction of the soul. He was offering her significance, purpose, a reason to exist that went beyond being a burden to be fed and housed. And God help her, but Abby wanted it. She wanted to matter. She wanted to be worth something. She looked at the papers, then back at Elijah. Slowly she nodded. What she didn't know was that in agreeing to help him, she had just signed her own death warrant. Mayor Caldwell already knew she was here. Will Hartwell had made sure of that. And even now, as she sat in the warmth of the cabin, feeling almost safe for the first time in years, 4 men were riding hard through the mountain passes with orders to bring her back and burn Elijah's world to the ground. For 2 weeks, a strange routine developed between them. Abby cooked. She mended Elijah's torn shirts with neat, even stitches. And during the long howling nights when the wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing, she read aloud from the stolen documents while Elijah cleaned his guns with methodical precision. She learned that Elijah wasn't just a brute. He was a man of deep brooding intelligence who had been cheated out of his own family land years ago by the same laws Caldwell exploited now. He listened to her reading with intense focus, his eyes never leaving the weapons in his hands, but she could tell he was remembering every name, every coordinate, every detail. His mind was a steel trap compensating for the education he had been denied. The physical distance between them began to shrink in small, almost imperceptible ways. When she passed him the coffee pot in the morning, their fingers would brush, and the contact would send a jolt of heat through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She would catch him watching her when she was kneading dough, his eyes tracing the movement of her arms, the capable strength in her hands. It made her flush a mixture of fear and something else, something new and blooming that she didn't know how to name. Desire, perhaps, though she had no frame of reference for it. No man had ever looked at her with anything but disgust or indifference. But Elijah looked at her like she was something worth studying, worth understanding. One afternoon, as the light began to fade and the temperature dropped even further, Abby made a discovery in the documents that made her blood run cold. She had been looking for patterns in Caldwell's acquisitions, trying to understand his strategy, and she found it. "Elijah," she said, her voice tight, "I found something." He looked up from the rifle he was oiling, his attention immediately sharp. "What?" Abby spread several documents across the table, her hands shaking slightly. "These aren't random purchases. Caldwell isn't just buying cheap land and hoping to find minerals. He's targeting specific people. Veterans." Elijah set down the rifle and moved to stand beside her, looking over her shoulder at the papers. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the gun oil and leather. "Every name on this list," Abby continued, pointing to a ledger, "is a veteran. Men who received homestead rights after the war, 160 acres free as payment for their service. But most of these men are wounded, sick, unable to farm effectively. Caldwell waits for them to struggle, then offers to buy for nothing. And look here." She pulled out a geological survey. "Every single property he's purchased has significant coal deposits. Bituminous coal, high grade, perfect for the railroad. He's not just stealing land. He's stealing from the men who bled for this country." Elijah was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold it sent shivers down her spine. "How many?" "According to this," Abby whispered, 47 homesteads already lost, and 73 more targeted. The number seemed to hit Elijah like a physical blow. He turned away, walking to the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the white landscape beyond. 47, he repeated, "a number that haunts me. Tommy was one of 32 who died at Shiloh, but Caldwell's greed has now cost 47 veteran families their land. The dead keep piling up because of him." Abby didn't know who Tommy was, but the pain in Elijah's voice told her it was someone important, someone whose loss still cut deep even after all these years. "He hasn't learned anything," Elijah said, more to himself than to her. "Still taking, still profiting from better men. I should have killed him in '65 when I had the chance." "You saw him after the war?" Abby asked. Elijah nodded, still staring out at the snow. "Denver, 1865. I tracked him down to his shiny new office, expensive suits, polished desk. He offered me whiskey like we were old friends, talked about the unfortunate circumstances of war." His hands clenched into fists. "I almost shot him right there. But Tommy wouldn't have wanted that." My brother believed in justice, not revenge, so I walked away. Spent 20 years waiting for the justice system to do its job. And it never did, Abby finished softly. No, Elijah agreed. It never did. But what neither of them knew, what the documents couldn't tell them, was that Will Hartwell's name was also on Caldwell's list, not as a target for land acquisition, but as an asset. A spy. A man so broken by debt and guilt that he would betray his own daughter to save himself. And at that very moment, as Abby and Elijah pored over evidence of Caldwell's crimes, a letter was being nailed to the cabin door, a letter that would change everything. On the 15th day since arriving at the cabin, Elijah found it during his morning perimeter check. The envelope was simple, addressed in shaky handwriting to Abigail. He brought it inside without comment and handed it to her. Abby stared at the letter, recognizing her father's handwriting immediately. Her hand shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Elijah stood nearby, watching her face, ready to catch her if the news was bad enough to make her fall. She read the letter once, then again, her eyes scanning the words as if perhaps she had misunderstood. Finally, she looked up at Elijah, her face drained of color. "What does it say?" he asked. Abby's voice was barely a whisper. "He says they're coming for me. Caldwell knows I'm here with you, and he's sending his best men." She swallowed hard, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "Fletcher Stone. My father says Fletcher Stone is coming, and that he never misses." Elijah's expression went dark. He walked to the mantel and picked up a faded tintype photograph, studying it for a moment before handing it to Abby. The image showed 3 young soldiers in Confederate gray. 2 were barely more than boys, their faces unlined and hopeful. The third was older, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through the camera into some dark place beyond. "That's Fletcher," Elijah said, pointing to the man with hollow eyes. "He was a sergeant in my unit, got captured at Shiloh, same battle where Tommy died, spent 2 years in Andersonville prison." Abby had heard of Andersonville. Everyone had. The notorious Union prison where Confederate soldiers were kept in conditions so brutal that men turned into animals just to survive. Starvation, disease, death by the thousands. Men did things there, Elijah continued, his voice flat and emotionless. Things nobody should have to do to stay alive. Fletcher came out broken. The war ended, but Fletcher kept fighting. Only now he fights for whoever pays the most. "But Caldwell betrayed the Confederate side," Abby said, confused. "Why would Fletcher work for him?" "Because Fletcher doesn't care about sides anymore," Elijah replied. "He only cares about surviving, and Caldwell pays well." He took the photograph back and set it carefully on the mantel. When he turned to face Abby again, his expression was harder than she had ever seen it. "Fletcher isn't like other thugs," Elijah said. "He's a trained soldier. He knows tactics, weaknesses. He won't come through the front door in broad daylight. He'll wait. Watch. Find the moment when we're most vulnerable." He paused, and something in his eyes made Abby's breath catch. "And he won't kill me first," Elijah continued. "He'll kill you, because Fletcher knows the best way to break a man is through what he protects." The words hung in the air between them. What he protects. As if Abby was something precious, something worth defending, as if she mattered beyond her ability to read documents and cook meals. "How do you know?" Abby whispered. "How do you know he'll target me?" Elijah's jaw clenched. "Because that's what I would do, if I wanted to break somebody." For the next 2 days, Elijah trained Abby with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But he didn't try to teach her to shoot. There wasn't time for her to develop the accuracy she would need. Instead, he taught her something far more dangerous. He taught her to think like a survivor. "You don't need to outshoot them," Elijah said, showing her how to grip the heavy cast-iron skillet. "You need to outsurvive them. This skillet weighs 10 pounds. You swing this into a kneecap, a man goes down. You swing it into a skull, he doesn't get back up." He showed her the massive pot they used for boiling water. "Aim for the face. Skin melts. They go blind. Can't shoot what they can't see. Abby hesitated, her hands hovering over the pot. "I can't hurt people." Elijah grabbed her shoulders firm, but not rough, forcing her to meet his eyes. "If Fletcher comes through that door, he won't hesitate. He'll gut you like a rabbit and make me watch. Can you live with the guilt of defending yourself, or do you want to die with a clean conscience?" Something in Abby hardened at those words. She picked up the skillet, feeling its weight, its potential. "Teach me," she said. For hours Elijah drilled her. Scenarios, responses, always thinking 2 moves ahead. If you use the boiling water, what's your backup? If you swing the skillet and miss, where's your next weapon? Never rely on a single tool. Always have options. He tested her strength, making her lift heavy water buckets, haul wood, swing the poker until her arms burned. And to his surprise and approval, she was strong. Not fast, but powerful. Town boys had called her slow, but strength wasn't about speed. It was about force, about the ability to deliver a blow that could end a fight in one strike. On the second night of training, after Abby's hands were wrapped in cloth to protect the blisters, they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. Elijah tended to her injuries with surprising gentleness, his rough fingers careful as they bound the clean strips around her palms. "Thank you," Abby whispered. "Not just for the training, for treating me like I'm worth something." Elijah didn't look up from his work. "You've always been worth something," he said quietly. Other people simply weren't worthy of seeing it. Abby looked at his face, at the scars, catching the firelight, at the hard lines that had been softened by the warm glow of the flames. She felt an impulse, sudden and overwhelming, to touch the scar on his cheekbone, to trace it with her fingers, and ask how he got it. Her hand began to rise of its own accord. Elijah caught her wrist gently but firmly. "Don't," he said. "Why not?" Abby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her heart race. Desire, longing, and beneath that fear. "Because if you touch me," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide, "I'll forget that there's a war coming, and both of us need to remember that." He released her wrist and stood walking to the window to stare out at the darkness. "Fletcher will be here by morning. You should sleep. You'll need your strength." Abby wanted to argue, wanted to cross the room and make him look at her again, make him admit that what was growing between them was real and not just the product of forced proximity. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested on the window frame as if he needed its support to stay upright. So she went to her bed and lay down, but sleep was impossible. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Elijah's breathing across the room, and wondered if tomorrow would bring death or salvation or something in between. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would bring all three. Morning arrived with brutal cold and a sky the color of old steel. Elijah moved through the cabin with military precision, checking weapons, securing supplies, preparing for a siege that might never come or might arrive in the next 5 minutes. Abby watched him work, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the way his hands moved with absolute certainty, even when his face betrayed nothing. "I have to check the trails," Elijah said, finally strapping on his gun belt. "Set tripwires. If Fletcher comes, I need to hear him coming." "Don't go," Abby said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "We can defend here together." Elijah shook his head. "If we're both trapped in this cabin, we're both dead. I need mobility." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Remember everything I taught you. Don't open the door for anyone. Is the bar secured?" "Yes." "Winchester loaded?" "Yes." "Water boiling?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face. "Be careful, Eli," Abby said softly. The use of his first name spoken with such gentle concern made him pause. He gave a sharp nod, pulled his hat low, and disappeared into the gray morning. Abby barred the door behind him, feeling the heavy oak settle into its brackets with a solid thunk. She checked the Winchester, made sure the water was at a rolling boil, positioned the cast-iron skillet within easy reach. Then she returned to the documents, trying to focus, trying to find something that would make sense of the conspiracy unfolding around them. She didn't know it yet, but what she was about to discover would shatter everything she thought she understood about her father, about this situation, about why Elijah had really taken her from that house. The document was near the bottom of the stack, folded and stained, but still legible. A property deed. She almost passed over it, but something about the address made her pause. Hartwell Ranch, 160 acres, Bitter Creek, Wyoming. Her hands began to shake as she unfolded it completely. The deed was dated January 15, 1886, 2 months from now, and the name listed as owner wasn't William Hartwell. It was Marcus Caldwell. Abby's mind reeled. Her father hadn't borrowed from Elijah to pay gambling debts. He had borrowed from Elijah to pay Caldwell's protection fees. And if Will couldn't pay, Caldwell would get the ranch. But there was more. Attached to the deed was a contract signed in her father's shaky handwriting. In exchange for delay of payment, William Hartwell agrees to provide information regarding Elijah Blackwood's activities and whereabouts. The words blurred as tears filled Abby's eyes. Her father hadn't just sold her to clear a debt. He had sold her to spy on Elijah to report back to Caldwell. And the warning letter, the one that had seemed like a moment of parental concern, hadn't been a warning at all. It had been bait, a way to make Elijah think Will was having second thoughts, to lower his guard, to make him vulnerable. William Hartwell wasn't just a coward, he was a traitor, and he had betrayed his daughter twice. Abby dropped the papers, her whole body shaking. She understood now why Elijah had asked about loyalty. It hadn't been a test, it had been a warning. He had known Will was compromised, had known that taking Abby away from her father wasn't just about collecting a debt. It was about protecting her from becoming collateral damage in a war she didn't even know was being fought. But that realization brought no comfort, because it also meant that Caldwell knew exactly where she was, that Fletcher Stone wasn't stumbling through the mountains hoping to find them. He knew. He had always known. And Elijah, riding out to set traps, had no idea. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The sky darkened early the way it did in winter in the mountains, and still Elijah didn't return. Abby paced the cabin, checking the window every few minutes, seeing nothing but snow and shadows and the terrible emptiness of waiting. At 6:47 in the evening she heard it. Not hoofbeats. Something worse. The sound of heavy boots on the porch. Multiple boots. Abby's heart stopped. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lever around into the chamber. The boots moved across the porch with deliberate heaviness, making sure she knew they were there, making sure she was afraid. Then a voice, rough and reedy and slurred with years of pain, called out through the door, "Open up, little lady. Sheriff's business." Fletcher Stone had arrived. Abby backed away from the door, the rifle heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. A second voice, younger and crueler, laughed from outside. "We know you're in there, girl. Saw the smoke from the chimney. Eli Blackwood's not here. We saw his tracks heading south. You're all alone." A third voice, this one cold and calculating, added, "And Mayor Caldwell wants his papers back. You open that door. Give them back nice and peaceful. Maybe he forgives this whole mess. You make us break in. Well, we'll have to entertain ourselves while we wait for Eli to come home." Abby's mind raced through everything Elijah had taught her. She couldn't outshoot 4 men. She couldn't outrun them. But she could maybe outsurvive them. She set the rifle down. It was useless to her. Instead, she moved to the stove where the massive pot of water bubbled and steamed. 5 gallons of scalding liquid, enough to do serious damage. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed into it. The oak bar groaned but held. Another impact, and she heard wood beginning to splinter near the hinges. Abby's hands closed around the pot handles, the heat radiating through even the thick rags she used as pot holders. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was surprisingly clear. Fear had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard determination. She heard Elijah's voice in her head. "You don't need to be fast. You need to be powerful. One good swing from you can end a man." The door splintered. The bar snapped with a sickening crack. The door flew open, and 4 men tumbled into the cabin, bringing with them swirling snow and the stink of unwashed bodies and violence. Fletcher Stone entered first, tall and scarred, his hollow eyes sweeping the cabin with the practiced efficiency of a predator. Behind him came a skinny man with a lantern and two others with rifles at the ready. Fletcher's eyes landed on Abby standing by the stove, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Well now," he drawled, "look at the size of her. Eli likes them well fed, doesn't he?" The skinny man laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Where are the papers, fat girl?" Abby stood her ground feet planted wide, the pot of boiling water in her hands. "Get out," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Fletcher unholstered his gun slowly, savoring the moment. "We'll take the papers. Then we'll wait for Eli. Maybe have a little fun while we're at it." His eyes traveled over Abby's body with disgusting intent. "You look like you could keep a man warm through a long winter." He took a step toward her. Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't think about being ladylike or gentle or any of the things women were supposed to be. She thought about her father selling her. She thought about Eli telling her that mass was survival. She thought about every person who had ever called her worthless. With a scream that tore from the very bottom of her soul, Abby heaved the massive pot of boiling water in a powerful arc. The impossible feat of strength, fueled by pure adrenaline and righteous fury, sent 5 gallons of scalding liquid directly into Fletcher Stone's face and chest. His scream was inhuman, a sound of agony so pure it seemed to shake the walls. He dropped his gun, clawing at his melting skin, falling to his knees and then to the floor, writhing and sobbing. The skinny man fumbled for his weapon, panic making him clumsy. Abby didn't stop. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove, 10 pounds of solid iron, and charged. The skinny man fired wildly, the bullet going high and shattering a jar on the shelf. Abby swung the skillet with both hands, putting her full 200 pounds behind the blow. The iron connected with his arm with a sickening crack of breaking bone. He dropped the lantern and oil spilled across the floor, igniting in a line of fire. The third man lunged for her, trying to grab her arms. Abby pivoted, using her weight like a weapon, and slammed the skillet into his kneecap. He went down, screaming, clutching his shattered leg. The fourth man raised his rifle, his hands shaking. He fired, and the bullet grazed Abby's shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin in a line of white-hot pain. But pain only made her angrier. She roared, actually roared like something feral, and swung the skillet one more time. The man ducked, and the skillet whistled past his head by inches. The sheer ferocity in Abby's face, the absolute lack of fear or hesitation, broke something in him. These men had expected a frightened girl. Instead, they had found a warrior. "Get out!" Abby screamed, her voice raw. "Get out, or I'll kill every last one of you!" The men, broken and burned and terrified, scrambled for the door. Fletcher was dragged by the others, still sobbing, his face and chest a ruin of scalded flesh. They stumbled into the snow, leaving trails of blood behind them. Abby slammed the broken door shut and shoved the heavy table against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, and with it came the shaking. She turned to the fire spreading across the floor and beat it out with a rug, stomping on the flames with her boots until nothing remained but smoke and char. Then her legs gave out. She slid down against the barricaded door, still clutching the bloody skillet, and began to shake so hard her teeth chattered. She had done it. She had fought off 4 armed men and survived. But survival came with a cost. Her shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed her. Her hands were blistered from the heat of the pot. And somewhere deep in her mind a small voice whispered that this wasn't over. Fletcher Stone was alive. Wounded, but alive. And men like him didn't forgive. They didn't forget. They came back. An hour passed, then another. Abby tried to stand to tend her wounds, but the blood loss and shock made everything seem distant and dreamlike. She managed to wrap her shoulder with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat, but the binding was clumsy and inadequate. Then cutting through the silence came the sound of hoofbeats. Fast, frantic, desperate. "Abby!" Elijah's voice roared from outside. "Abby!" She tried to move the table, but her arms had no strength left. "Eli!" she called back, her voice breaking on his name. The door was shoved open with such force that the table scraped across the floor despite Abby's weight against it. Elijah burst through snow-covered and wild-eyed, his gun drawn and ready. He saw the scorch marks on the floor, the broken crockery, the blood, the smell of burnt oil and fear and violence. And finally, he saw Abby sitting on the floor with the skillet still clutched in her hands, her shoulder wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. Elijah holstered his gun and dropped to his knees in front of her. His hands hovered shaking, as if he was afraid touching her would confirm that she was really hurt, that she had really been in danger while he was gone. "Did they touch you?" he demanded, his voice cracking in a way she had never heard before. "Abby, look at me. Did they touch you?" Abby looked up into his face and saw something that stole what little breath she had left. Fear. Real, raw, unguarded fear. This man who had faced down debtors and criminals and the ghosts of war was terrified. Not of death, not of violence, but of losing her. "No," she whispered. "I scalded one, broke another's arm, shot grazed my shoulder, but I'm okay." Elijah stared at her, then at the overturned pot, then at the bloody skillet. He realized what she had done. She had fought off 4 armed enforcers with nothing but kitchen implements and fury. His face transformed, shifting through shock to something that looked almost like awe. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. His whole body was shaking. "I rode as fast as I could," he said, his voice muffled. "I saw Fletcher's tracks. I thought they had—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terror that had driven him to ride through dangerous terrain at a speed that could have killed both him and his horse. The terror of finding her dead, of being too late, of losing the first thing that had mattered to him in 20 years. Abby leaned into his warmth, into his strength, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't gratitude. This wasn't the appreciation of a master for a useful servant. This was something far more dangerous. This was love, raw and new and terrifying in its intensity. "You're not just okay," Elijah whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a warrior, Abby, a damn warrior." They held each other as the fire crackled and the wind howled, and somewhere in the darkness, Fletcher Stone and his men were fleeing down the mountain, carrying with them a message for Mayor Caldwell. The girl wasn't weak. The mountain man wasn't alone. And the war they thought they were fighting, it had just escalated in ways none of them could have predicted. Because Abigail Hartwell had discovered something that night that would change the course of everything to come. She had discovered that she was not a victim. She was not cattle to be traded or property to be owned. She was a force of nature, and heaven help anyone who stood in her way. The night after the attack stretched long and trembling, filled with the sounds of wind whistling through the splintered doorframe and the crackle of the fire Eli had built up to a roar. Neither of them could sleep. The adrenaline that had turned Abby into a force of nature had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion and a residual terror that made her hands shake whenever she tried to hold anything. Eli worked in silence for the first hour, using scrap lumber and heavy nails to reinforce the broken door, barricading them in against the night and whatever might come with the dawn. Every strike of his hammer was precise, controlled violence channeled into something constructive. He moved with a slight limp that he tried to hide, but Abby noticed the blood seeping through the denim of his thigh. "You're hurt," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, hollow but steady. "It's nothing," Eli replied without looking at her. "Branch caught me on the ride back. Sit down, Eli." He paused mid-swing, the hammer hovering in the air. Before today, he might have argued, might have told her to mind her own business and tend to the stew. But the dynamic in the cabin had shifted irrevocably. The woman who had thrown boiling water on an armed man was not a servant. She was a partner. He sat on the edge of the bed, setting the hammer aside. Abby brought the basin of warm water and clean cloth, kneeling between his spread knees in a position that was intimate and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with injury. She rolled up his pant leg carefully and saw immediately that it wasn't a branch scratch. It was a bullet graze, a shallow furrow in the muscle that wept blood with every movement. "They shot at you," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the angry red flesh. "I shot back," Eli grunted. Then he hissed through his teeth when she applied the wet cloth. Abby worked gently, cleaning the wound with the same careful precision she brought to everything she did. She could feel his eyes on her, heavy and unblinking, studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Being this close to him, smelling the leather and sweat and pine that clung to him like a second skin, made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Why didn't you run?" Eli asked softly. "When they broke in, you could have gone out the back window, hidden in the woods." Abby tied the knot on the bandage she had fashioned from strips of her petticoat and looked up at him. "And leave your home. Leave the papers you risked everything to steal. You trusted me to guard them. I couldn't betray that trust." "I trusted you to survive," Eli corrected, reaching out to cup her cheek with his large, rough hand. His thumb brushed over her skin in a touch so tender it made her breath hitch. I didn't know you had that kind of fire in you. I thought I was bringing a soft thing up the mountain to keep it safe. I was wrong. I was never soft," Abby said, leaning slightly into his touch, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "I was just heavy. People think they're the same thing. They think because I take up space I'm slow. Because I'm quiet, I'm stupid. My father," she choked on the word, "my father made me believe I was a burden." "Your father is a blind fool," Eli growled, his hand moving from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling gently in her hair. "You are not a burden, Abby. You are the anchor. A man could build a life around a woman like you, a life that wouldn't blow away in the first storm." The air in the room grew thick, charged with the electricity of survival and proximity, and something far more dangerous than either. Abby looked at his lips, thin and severe now, parted slightly as he struggled with words and feelings he had buried for 20 years. Eli leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. "If I kiss you now," he murmured, his voice rough as gravel, "I won't be able to stop, and we have a war to fight." Abby closed her eyes, savoring the heat radiating from him, the strength in the hand that cradled her neck. "Then fight the war, Eli," she whispered. "But don't you dare die, because I'm not going back to being invisible." Eli pulled back, his eyes burning with a dark promise that made her stomach flip. "We leave at first light," he said, his voice all business now, though she could still see the emotion flickering beneath the surface. "We can't defend this cabin again. Caldwell knows we have the papers. He'll send 20 men next time, maybe more." "Where do we go?" Abby asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Back to Bitter Creek," Eli said, standing and testing his bandaged leg. "Time to introduce the town to the real Abigail Hartwell. Time to finish this." But even as he spoke with such confidence, neither of them knew that Will Hartwell had already received word of the failed attack. And in his desperate attempt to salvage his deal with Caldwell, to prove he was still useful, he had sent another message. This one telling Caldwell exactly when Eli and Abby would arrive in town, exactly what route they would take, and exactly how many men it would take to end this rebellion once and for all. The descent into Bitter Creek the next morning was nothing like the ascent had been. Abby no longer rode behind Eli, clinging to him like a frightened child. She rode his pack mule, a stubborn creature named Jasper, sitting upright with her spine straight despite the ache in her wounded shoulder. Eli had cut down one of his buffalo coats to fit her, and wrapped in the heavy fur she looked like something wild and untamed, something that belonged to the mountains rather than the tame parlors of town. The documents were strapped to her chest beneath the coat in a waterproof oilskin satchel. They were her armor now, her protection, and her weapon all in one. As they rode down the main thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, heads turned. People recognized Eli Blackwood immediately, the mountain specter, the killer, the man who collected debts with the cold efficiency of winter itself. But their eyes lingered longer on the woman beside him. It took them a moment to place her. The Hartwell girl, the fat one. But she looked different. She hadn't lost a pound, but she carried her weight differently now. Not as a burden to be ashamed of, but as a presence solid and undeniable. She met their stares without flinching, without dropping her gaze or trying to make herself smaller. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, clutched her shawl and whispered to her companion, Is that really her?" But when Abby's eyes met Mrs. Gable's, it was the older woman who looked away, first flustered and uncertain. "Head high," Eli murmured from his horse. "You own the ground you walk on." They didn't ride to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was in Caldwell's pocket, had been for years, and everyone in town knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. Instead, Eli led them straight to the Bitter Creek Gazette, a small ink-stained building next to the saloon that served as the town's only newspaper. The editor, Samuel Brooks, was a cynical man in his mid-50s who had seen too much during the war and trusted too little since. He had fought as a sergeant under various commanders, including a brief stint where his path had crossed Eli's. They weren't friends exactly, but they shared the bond of men who had survived hell together. They dismounted, and Eli tethered the horses with quick, efficient movements. "Inside," he said quietly. "Quickly." The newspaper office smelled of lead type and stale tobacco and the particular mustiness of old paper. Samuel Brooks looked up from his desk, adjusting his spectacles, and froze when he saw Eli standing in his doorway. "Blackwood," Samuel said wearily. "I heard you were dead, or about to be." "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated," Eli said, the ghost of dark humor in his voice. He gestured to Abby. "Show him." Abby unbuckled the oilskin satchel and removed the stack of documents, slamming them onto Samuel's desk with enough force to make him jump. Her voice when she spoke was clear and authoritative, nothing like the hesitant girl who had left this town weeks ago. "Mayor Caldwell has been falsifying land surveys," she stated. "He's been declaring veteran homesteads barren, buying them for pennies, then hiding the coal and silver deposits. He's stealing from every man who bled for this country." Samuel picked up one of the documents, his eyes widening as he scanned the contents. "This is the deed to the Henderson Ranch, and the geological survey shows high-grade bituminous coal. But Caldwell told Henderson the land was worthless alkali soil." "Print it," Eli commanded. "Special edition. Today. Now." Samuel set the paper down, his hands trembling slightly. "I can't just print this, Blackwood. Caldwell will burn this building down with me inside. I need protection. I need a judge to verify these documents first." "Once the ranchers know they were swindled," Abby said, stepping forward, "Caldwell won't have anywhere to hide. The whole town will turn on him. You'll have all the protection you need." But what Samuel didn't know, what Abby hadn't told anyone yet, was that she had already made arrangements. 2 days ago, when Eli had ridden out to set his traps, Abby had paid a writer from a neighboring ranch to carry a copy of the most damning documents to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. It had cost her the last piece of her mother's jewelry, a small silver ring she had been wearing on a chain around her neck. But it had been worth it. If they died here today, the evidence would still reach the right hands. Suddenly, the front window exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the room in a glittering cascade of destruction. Eli tackled Abby to the floor as a bullet buried itself in the wall where her head had been a moment before. "Get down!" Eli roared, drawing both his revolvers with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had drawn weapons 1,000 times before. Outside, the street had cleared as if by magic, people scattering to safety with the instinct of those who had lived through violence before. Standing in the muddy thoroughfare, surrounded by 6 armed deputies, was Mayor Marcus Caldwell. He was a small man, dapper in his expensive suit, holding a cane that everyone in town knew concealed a blade. His face was composed, pleasant, even as if shooting into a building was simply part of the day's business. "Send the girl out, Blackwood." Caldwell called his voice smooth and oily, the voice of a man accustomed to getting his way through charm before resorting to force. "Send her out with my property, and maybe I'll let you hang quickly instead of slow." Eli crouched beneath the windowsill, his body positioned to shield Abby from any angle of fire. He looked at her, checking for blood, for wounds, for any sign that the flying glass had cut her. She was unharmed, but her eyes were wide with the fear that came from being shot at, from understanding that men were trying to kill her, not for anything she had done, but simply for what she knew. "He can't let us live," Eli whispered to her, his voice low and urgent. "Not now. We know too much." "What do we do?" Abby asked, gripping the satchel of documents like a lifeline. Eli's jaw clenched. "I'm going to draw their fire. There's a back door through the press room. You take the papers, run to the livery stable, get a fresh horse ride hard for Cheyenne. Find the U.S. Marshal. Make him listen." "No," Abby said flatly. "Abby, this isn't a debate." "You're right," she agreed. "It's not. I'm not leaving you. That's suicide, Eli. There are 6 of them, and 1 of you. It's the only way to make sure the evidence survives." Eli argued, his voice taking on a desperate edge she had never heard before. "You are the mission now. You're what matters." "I am not a mission," Abby hissed, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "I'm your partner. We do this together or not at all." Before Eli could argue further, a voice drifted in from the street, a voice that made Abby's blood freeze in her veins. "Abby, Abby girl, come out now." It was her father. Will Hartwell stood next to Mayor Caldwell, looking nervous and disheveled, his clothes hanging on his thin frame like they belonged to a larger man he used to be. But he wasn't bound. He wasn't being held at gunpoint. He was standing with them voluntarily, willingly. Abby crawled to the edge of the window and peered over the sill, needing to see with her own eyes what her mind already knew. Her father had betrayed her. Not once, but twice. And now he was trying to do it a 3rd time. "Abby, honey." Will called out, his voice shaking with something that might have been fear or guilt or the toxic combination of both. "Mr. Caldwell says if you come out and give back the papers, he'll forgive everything. The debt, all of it. He'll even give us $1,000. We can start over Abby, just you and me, like before." The words hit her like physical blows. Like before. As if before had been something good, something worth returning to. As if she would choose to go back to being invisible and worthless and a burden. Eli looked at Abby, his eyes full of a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "Don't listen to him," he said quietly. But Abby was looking at her father, really looking at him, and she saw something she had never allowed herself to see before. Will Hartwell was not a good man, brought down by circumstance. He was a weak man who had made weak choices his entire life, who had sacrificed others to save himself over and over again until there was nothing left of him but cowardice and excuses. Something inside Abigail Hartwell hardened into diamond in that moment. Something crystallized and became unbreakable. "I have an idea," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Abby, don't—" Eli started, but she was already standing, already stepping out of his reach. "Samuel," she said to the trembling newspaper editor, "do you have matches?" Samuel fumbled in his desk drawer and produced a box of sulfur matches, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. Abby took them with steady fingers and then did something that made both Eli and Samuel stare at her in horror. She took the entire stack of survey documents, the only proof they had of Caldwell's crimes, the evidence that had cost Eli 20 years of planning and Abby her entire old life, and she held them up in one hand. In her other hand, she held the box of matches. "Abby, what are you doing?" Eli demanded, starting to rise. But Abby was already moving, kicking the door open and stepping out onto the porch of the newspaper office. The cold hit her like a slap, but she barely felt it. 6 guns swung to point directly at her chest. In the periphery of her vision, she could see townspeople peeking out from behind windows and doorways, watching, waiting to see what would happen to the girl they had dismissed as worthless. "You want these?" Abby called out, her voice ringing clear down the street, carrying farther than it had any right to in the thin mountain air. "Hand them over, my dear," Caldwell said, extending a gloved hand with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. "And no one gets hurt." Abby struck a match. The flame flared bright orange against the gray winter sky, small but deadly promise and threat, all in one tiny point of light. "Don't!" Caldwell shrieked, his composure cracking for the first time. "Shoot her! No, don't shoot, you'll hit the papers." The deputies froze, caught in an impossible bind. If they shot her, she might drop the match. If they didn't shoot her, she controlled the situation. For the first time in her life, Abigail Hartwell held power. real power, the kind that made men with guns hesitate. "Abby, what are you doing?" Will wailed from his position behind Caldwell. "That's money. That's our future." Abby looked at her father, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. "This isn't money, Pa," she said, her voice carrying to every ear that strained to hear. "This is the truth, and I'll burn it to ash before I let you profit from it one more time." She held the flame inches from the paper, close enough that everyone could see how easy it would be, how one small movement would destroy everything. "Elijah Blackwood walks free," Abby announced, her voice steady and strong. "He gets on his horse and he rides out of here. If anyone follows him, I burn the proof. If anyone shoots, I burn the proof. You let him go, or I destroy the only leverage you have over this entire valley." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble built on the assumption that Caldwell didn't know about the copies already en route to the U.S. Marshal. But Caldwell couldn't know. Will didn't know. Nobody knew except Abby herself. "Let him go and leave you with the evidence," Caldwell sneered. "I wasn't born yesterday, girl." "I'm not going anywhere," Abby said calmly. "I'm too slow to run. Remember, everyone in this town has told me that my whole life. I'll stay right here and hand over the papers once Eli is safely away. You'll have me and the evidence both. But if you try to take him, I burn it all." Inside the newspaper office, Eli stared at Abby's back, his heart breaking. She was trading herself for him. After everything, after he had taken her to save her, she was selling herself to save him. The symmetry was almost poetic in its cruelty. "No," Eli whispered, but the word had no force behind it, because he knew Abby well enough now to know that once she had made a decision, there was no changing her mind. He stood up, holstering his guns with deliberate slowness, and walked to the door. He stepped out onto the porch, standing behind Abby, close enough to feel the heat of her body, far enough that he wouldn't interfere with what she was doing. "I'm not leaving," Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Abby turned to look at him, her eyes pleading. "Go, please." "We do this together," Eli said simply. "Or we end it here." The standoff stretched seconds, feeling like hours, the match burning down slowly toward Abby's fingertips. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. And then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came the sound of heavy carriage wheels on the frozen mud of the street. A black carriage rolled around the corner, and on its side was emblazoned the seal of the Territorial Circuit Court. Judge Henry Morrison had arrived, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals wearing badges that caught the weak winter sunlight. Abby's eyes flicked to the carriage, and in that moment Caldwell saw his future crumbling. He couldn't kill them in front of a federal judge. He couldn't disappear the evidence with marshals as witnesses. His face went from confident to pale in the space of a heartbeat. "Fletcher," Caldwell hissed to the scarred man standing among his deputies, his face still wrapped in bandages from Abby's attack. "Get the papers, now." Fletcher Stone lunged forward, his massive hand reaching for the documents Abby held. But Abby didn't burn them. She had no intention of destroying evidence that could save dozens of families. Instead, she swung the heavy stack of papers up, smashing them into Fletcher's scalded, bandaged face. Fletcher roared in pain, stumbling backward, momentarily blinded by the impact against his burns. It was the split second Eli needed. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession. Eli didn't aim to kill, though God knew he wanted to. He aimed to dismantle. The first bullet shattered Fletcher's kneecap, dropping him into the mud like a felled tree. The second struck the pistol in Mayor Caldwell's hand, sending the weapon spinning away in a spray of blood from Caldwell's numbed fingers. But Caldwell's other deputies raised their weapons, and suddenly the street erupted into chaos. Bullets cracked through the air. Eli dove behind a water trough, returning fire with the methodical precision of a man who had fought in real battles, not just back alley ambushes. Abby dropped to the ground, clutching the documents to her chest, making herself as small a target as possible. And then something happened that nobody expected. Will Hartwell, standing frozen in the crossfire, saw one of Caldwell's deputies taking careful aim at Abby's prone form. And in that moment, something broke inside him. Or perhaps something that had been broken for 20 years finally tried to heal. He thought of Ruth on her deathbed, making him promise to protect their daughter. He thought of the 30 men who had died because of his cowardice at a different crossfire in a different war. He thought of every choice he had made that had led to this moment, every time he had chosen himself over someone he loved. With a roar that came from somewhere deep in his ruined soul, Will Hartwell tackled the deputy. The gun fired, but the bullet went into the dirt instead of into Abby's back. The deputy, caught off guard, turned and slammed his fist into Will's face, knocking the older man to the ground where he lay bleeding and gasping. But he had bought Abby 3 precious seconds. 3 seconds in which she scrambled to her feet and ran toward the cover of the newspaper office. "Hold your fire!" Judge Henry Morrison's voice boomed across the street with the authority of a man who had sent dozens of men to the gallows and felt no guilt about it. The marshals flanking him had their own weapons drawn now, and suddenly Caldwell's deputies found themselves outnumbered and outranked. The shooting stopped. An eerie silence fell over Bitter Creek, broken only by the moaning of wounded men and the heavy breathing of those still standing. Mayor Marcus Caldwell stood in the middle of the street, clutching his injured hand, blood dripping through his fingers. The pleasant mask he wore had slipped entirely, revealing the cruel, calculating man beneath. His eyes darted from the judge to the marshals to Eli to Abby, calculating odds, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Will Hartwell lay in the mud, his face bloody, his breathing labored. But he was looking at Abby with something in his eyes that might have been hope or might have been a plea for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Abby stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her buffalo coat. She was disheveled, her hair wild, the bandage on her shoulder visible through a tear in her dress. But she looked magnificent. She looked like exactly what she had become, a woman who had walked through fire and come out forged into something stronger than steel. She stepped off the porch and walked through the mud past the cowering deputies, past her fallen father, straight to Judge Morrison. Every eye in the town was on her. Every breath was held. "Judge Morrison," Abby said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe you're looking for the truth about the mining claims in this valley." She held out the documents, and the judge took them with hands that had signed execution orders without trembling. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read, flipping through page after page of falsified surveys, forged deeds, geological reports that proved beyond any doubt that Marcus Caldwell had built his empire on theft and lies. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold as winter. "Arrest him," he said to the marshals, "and arrest his deputies as accessories." One of the marshals moved to where Fletcher Stone lay in the mud, still clutching his shattered knee. "This one needs a doctor before the jail," the marshal said. Judge Morrison looked down at Fletcher with cold eyes. "He'll get one, and then he'll stand trial for attempted murder. That should be good for 10 to 15 years in territorial prison, even with his war record." The sound of handcuffs clicking onto Caldwell's wrists was the sweetest sound Abby had ever heard. The mayor, who had seemed untouchable, who had controlled the town through fear and money, and the corruption of men like Sheriff Miller, was being led away like a common criminal. But the drama wasn't over yet. Will Hartwell struggled to his feet, blood running from his nose and split lip. He stumbled toward Abby, his arms outstretched in a gesture that was half supplication, half desperation. "Abby," he gasped. "You did it. We're rich now. We can sue for damages. Come on, daughter. Let's go home." Abby looked at the man who had given her life, who had raised her, who had betrayed her more times than she could count. She saw the smallness of him, not in his physical stature, but in his spirit. She saw a man who had spent his entire life running from his own mistakes, blaming others for his failures, sacrificing anyone and everyone to save himself. "Abby, please," Will said, and now there were tears mixing with the blood on his face. "I tried to help. I tackled that deputy. I saved you. Doesn't that count for something?" "You sold me, Pa," Abby said quietly. "Then you stood with Caldwell to sell me again." "I was scared," Will pleaded. "The debt was crushing me. Your mother, I couldn't save her. I haven't been able to save anything or anyone. I'm weak, Abby. I know that. "But I'm your father." "You were my father," Abby corrected, and her voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who had finally learned to set boundaries to protect herself. "Mama told you to take care of me. Instead, you chose gold over blood. You chose it twice. I won't choose you over myself a third time." "But I love you," Will sobbed, and perhaps in his own twisted way he believed it was true. "I know you do, Pa," Abby said, and there was genuine sadness in her voice. "But your love is poison. It takes more than it gives. It hurts more than it heals. I'm going home now, but not with you." She turned her back on Will Hartwell, and the symbolism of the gesture was not lost on anyone watching. The girl he had tried to make invisible had just erased him from her life with the same casual dismissal he had always shown her. Abby walked to where Eli stood by his horse, holstering his weapons with movements made automatic by years of practice. He looked at her with eyes that held exhaustion and admiration and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "The debt is settled," Eli said, gesturing toward the scene where Caldwell was being loaded into the judge's carriage. "You're free, Abby. You can go anywhere now. The town will call you a hero." Abby reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a deliberateness that made the gesture a claim, a choice, a declaration. "I don't want the town's praise," she said quietly. "And I don't want to be free if freedom means being away from you." Something flickered across Eli's face, some emotion so powerful it seemed to physically pain him to contain it. Without caring about the watching crowd, without thinking about propriety or reputation or what anyone would say, he pulled Abby close and kissed her forehead, a gesture of tenderness that somehow felt more intimate than any passionate embrace could have been. "Then let's go home," he said. They mounted their horses, Abby on Jasper the mule and Eli on his great black stallion, and they rode out of Bitter Creek side by side. They didn't look back at Will Hartwell, who stood in the mud weeping. They didn't look back at the townspeople who were already starting to whisper and gossip and rewrite history to make themselves seem less culpable in the suffering of their neighbors. They rode toward the mountains, toward the cabin that would need extensive repairs, toward a future that was uncertain and probably difficult, but was theirs and theirs alone to build. Will Hartwell remained on his knees in the mud long after they had gone, long after the crowd dispersed, long after the marshals had finished their arrests. Samuel Brooks, watching from his office window, would later write that he saw the former captain weeping, not the tears of self-pity, but the tears of a man who had finally understood the full weight of what he had lost. By morning, Will would be gone, his few possessions abandoned, heading east on the first stage. He would spend the rest of his days drifting from town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to learn his name, carrying the ghost of a daughter who had been brave enough to do what he never could choose herself. Behind them, Samuel Brooks returned to his printing press with a story that would make headlines across the territory. The story of how a forgotten girl had brought down a corrupt empire, how a mountain man had finally achieved justice for his murdered brother, how courage could be found in the most unlikely of people. And in the street, Will Hartwell sank to his knees in the mud watching his daughter ride away, finally understanding that some debts can never be repaid, some trust once broken can never be mended, and some love, when it is selfish enough, becomes its own punishment. Epilogue. 6 months later. Spring came to the Teton Mountains with an explosion of wildflowers and the sound of snowmelt rushing down ancient channels carved in stone. The cabin on the ridge had been expanded, a new room added, and the roof reinforced with proper shingles that wouldn't leak. A garden plot had been turned the soil dark and rich with the promise of vegetables that would see them through the next winter. Abby stood on the porch, her hands resting on the railing Eli had built, looking out over the valley below. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, one that actually fit her properly instead of pinching and binding. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the afternoon sunlight. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear Eli's voice halting and careful sounding out words in the primer she had made for him. He was learning to read slowly, but with the same determination he brought to everything. Every evening after dinner, they sat by the fire, and she taught him, watched with pride as he transformed from a man who couldn't read to a man who could decipher not just words, but meaning, nuance, the subtle ways language could be used as both weapon and shield. The town had changed too. Samuel Brooks' newspaper had sparked investigations that rippled far beyond Bitter Creek. Caldwell was awaiting trial in Denver, his properties seized, his empire dismantled. Dozens of veterans had reclaimed their land armed with proper documentation and the protection of federal law. Sheriff Miller had been removed from office and replaced with a former corporal who had lost an arm at Shiloh but gained the respect of every honest man in the territory. Abby had become something of a legend, though she tried to avoid town when she could. People called her a hero. Some called her other things, whispered that it wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to live alone on a mountain with a man. But those whispers had no power over her anymore. She had faced down armed men. She had stood up to her father. She had chosen her own path. She and Eli weren't married, not in any legal sense, but they were bound together by something stronger than any document or ceremony. They were bound by choice, by respect, by the kind of partnership that was built in fire and tested in blood. "Abby," Eli's voice called from inside, "come here, I want to show you something." She went inside, letting the screen door bang shut behind her. Eli was sitting at the table, the primer open in front of him, but he was holding a piece of paper she didn't recognize. His face was lit with an expression of pride that made him look younger, almost boyish. "What is it?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "Letter," he said. "From the territory. They're offering me a job. Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Mountain District. They want someone who knows the land who can't be bought. Samuel Brooks recommended me." Abby's heart swelled. "That's wonderful, Eli." "There's more," he said, and now there was something nervous in his voice, something uncertain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I went to town last week, while you were visiting with the Henderson family. I've been thinking about making things official. If you'd want to." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band, unadorned but solid real. "I know I'm not much of a catch," Eli continued, speaking faster now, rushing to get the words out before his courage failed. "I'm older than you. I can barely read. I've got more enemies than friends, and this cabin is isolated, and the winters are hard. But I love you, Abby. I love your strength and your courage and the way you see the world. I love that you turned fear into power. I love that you chose yourself even when it was hard." He looked up at her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes, the same fear of rejection he had probably felt his entire life, the fear that he wasn't good enough, smart enough, civilized enough. "I love you too," Abby said, and watched relief wash over his face like sunrise. "And yes, 1,000 times yes." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, for the first time. Not a gentle brush of lips on forehead, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Abby laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, something she hadn't known she was capable of until this moment. "What's funny?" Eli asked, smiling despite himself. "I was just thinking," Abby said, "about how I used to believe I was worthless, how I thought I was too heavy, too plain, too much of a burden for anyone to want. And now here I am engaged to a man who sees me as I really am, who values my strength instead of mocking my size, who made me a partner instead of a servant." "You were never worthless," Eli said firmly. "You were just surrounded by people who were too blind to see your value." "No," Abby corrected gently. "I was surrounded by people who made me blind to my own value. There's a difference. They didn't steal my worth. They made me forget I had it. But I remember now." She walked back to the porch, Eli following close behind. Together they looked out over the valley, over the life they had built and would continue to build one day at a time. "Do you ever think about your father?" Eli asked quietly. "Sometimes," Abby admitted. "I heard he left town, headed east maybe. Samuel said he was drinking more than ever, talking about starting over somewhere nobody knew his name. Do you regret not forgiving him? Abby thought about it for a long moment. No, she finally said. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to someone who hurt you. It's a gift, and you give it if and when you're ready. Maybe someday I'll be ready. But right now I need to focus on building something good, not fixing something broken that wasn't my responsibility to fix in the first place. Eli nodded, understanding. He knew about broken fathers, about the weight of expectation and the pain of disappointment. His own father had hanged himself rather than face the shame of losing the family land. Some wounds were too deep to heal. Some broken things were better left behind. What about Tommy? Abby asked. It was a question she had never quite dared to voice before. Would he be proud of what you did, taking down Caldwell? Eli was quiet for a long time, so long that Abby thought perhaps he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I think Tommy would be proud that I didn't kill Caldwell when I had the chance, that I let the law handle it even though every instinct screamed for revenge. Tommy always believed in justice over vengeance. He was better than me in that way, better than me in a lot of ways. He sounds like he was a good man, Abby said softly. He was, Eli agreed. He was only 14, but he had more honor in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. I think he would have liked you. I think he would have said, I finally did something smart. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the mountains. In the valley below, smoke rose from chimneys in Bitter Creek. Life went on. People raised families and tended crops and told stories about the winter when the mountain man and the oversized girl took down the most powerful man in the territory. But up here on the ridge, life was simpler. Harder in some ways with the isolation and the brutal winters, but simpler in the ways that mattered. No pretense, no performance. Just two people who had found each other against all odds and decided that was enough. More than enough. Abby looked down at the ring on her finger, catching the light, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had been sold like cattle. She had been betrayed by her own father. She had fought off armed men with nothing but kitchen implements and fury. She had stood in a street with a match in her hand and gambled everything on a bluff. And through it all, she had discovered something precious. Not that she needed to be smaller, quieter, less, but that she had always been enough, had always been strong, had always been valuable. She had just been looking for validation in all the wrong places. What are you thinking about? Eli asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. I'm thinking, Abby said, leaning into him, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing. If my father hadn't sold me, I never would have found you. I never would have discovered I could be brave. I never would have learned that I was the anchor, not the burden. Sometimes, Eli agreed, the worst moments are just the beginning of the best chapters. As the sun set over the Teton Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple, Abby Hartwell, soon to be Abby Blackwood, made a promise to herself. She promised that she would never again let anyone make her feel small, that she would never again apologize for taking up space, that she would never again bow her head to men who mistook kindness for weakness. She was the Mountain Queen now, and she wore her crown with pride. In the end, Abigail Hartwell proved that value isn't measured in pounds or beauty or the opinions of small-minded people. It's measured in courage, in loyalty, in the willingness to stand up when it would be easier to stay down. She found sanctuary in the wilderness, discovered that the people society throws away are often made of the strongest steel. Her father had called her a burden, a girl too heavy to be wanted. But Eli had seen the truth. She was never the burden. She was always the anchor, the foundation upon which something strong and lasting could be built. And in a world that tried to make her invisible, she had become impossible to ignore. The story of the Mountain Queen would be told for generations. Mothers would tell it to daughters who felt too big, too much, too loud. Veterans would tell it to each other over campfires, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. and up on the ridge in a sturdy cabin with a garden and a future, two people who had been broken by the world would spend the rest of their lives proving that broken things, when put together right, can be stronger than they ever were before. The debt had been paid, the war had been won, and love, fierce and unlikely and absolutely undeniable, had conquered all.